Hello, I'm Matthew Wake, and I'm the owner of an independent bookstore called Books in Lausanne, Switzerland. I'm joined by writer, reader, and translator Michelle Bailat-Jones, and we're here to talk to author and Morges Book Festival sort of regular, Paul Lynch. Paul's the author of 4 novels. Red Sky in the Morning was his debut novel, followed by Black Snow, Grace, and then most recently Beyond the Sea. He's written regularly for the newspapers, I guess notably for the Sunday Times on film and also for the Irish Times, and he's won numerous awards. So Paul, Beyond the Sea, published in 2019 by Oneworld, and then last year it came out in paperback. Perhaps you could just start by telling us a little bit about the main characters of the book.
Well, thank you for having me. So Beyond the Sea is a novel about 2 South American fishermen who go to sea before a storm. We have Bolivar is really the center of the novel, and Bolivar is determined to go out to sea on this particular day, though he's warned there's a storm coming and his partner is missing, and he needs somebody to go out in the boat with him. And so he forces his boss to find him a partner. And Hector arrives on the beach, and Hector is this kind of sullen teenager who initially wants to go out on the boat, and then he realizes there's a storm coming, and he's like, nah, I got other things to be doing. And Bolivar smooth talks him into it. And what happens is they go to sea, and they meet the storm. And, you know, I'm not giving anything away here because fundamentally that's the beginning of the novel. And what happens from that point on is their outboard motor is destroyed and they are washed out into the Pacific Ocean, which is the equivalent of being washed out into an abyss, because the ocean is such an enormous expanse that after a period of time, if you're not caught by the Coast Guard, you're gone. And so the men are cast adrift, and they're going further and further out. And as this happens, they start to sort of move outside time. And these 2 men in the boat move into a sort of mythic place where, I suppose in a strange way, it's not unlike Schrodinger's cat, because they're both alive and dead at the same time. They are alive because they're in the boat and they're trying to figure out, how do we survive this? How do we stay alive? How do we keep ourselves fed? How do we have enough drinking water? How do we keep up the spirit? How do we fight the despair that's overcoming us? But at the same time, to any reasonable thinking person, they're also dead, because the chances of them being rescued are close to non-existent. And so that's the fundamental tension that's taking place in the book.
So this novel is quite actually different from your first 3 novels, in the sense that your first 3 novels were historical, set in Ireland, and then this book is very different, South American and contemporary, quite contemporary, in fact. And so I'm just curious, can you talk a little bit about how the idea came to you, or sort of the genesis of the story for this novel?
Yeah, well, I realized for some time that I wanted to write a novel that took me outside the Irish cultural space, or certainly outside the geographical space that is Ireland. There's something about growing up and living on an island this size that you feel imposed upon, you feel in circles. You know, we are literally in circles, but in my 3 previous novels, Red Sky Morning and Black Snow and Grace, I've always sought to sort of move the reader out into sort of to create a feeling of sort of mythic space, a cosmic space within the novel, so that these feelings of timelessness would occur within the book that would seem to do away with the feeling of being in Ireland. But with this book, with the 4th novel, I had the sense that I just needed to escape. And initially, what happened was I came across a real life story about two South American fishermen who got washed out to sea. I think it was in 2014, if I remember correctly. And over a year later, one of them washed up at an island in the Marshall Islands in the middle of the Pacific, and he'd been at sea for over a year, and he was alone, and it was a big story at the time. But the interesting thing for me is because I would never be interested in just writing a simple survival story. That's essentially journalism, as far as for me. But what happened was, as I was reading about it, I had this thunderbolt of, I literally saw the entire novel come to me, and it was not a novel of survival. It was a parable. It was a sort of meditation on the human condition, that this idea of two men in a boat could create for me an existential vacuum in which the two men, lost in space, so to speak, could really start to dive in to these fundamental questions of who they are and who they were, more importantly, when they had their lives, and how they would come to be haunted by their various pasts, but also how they would begin to change by this great kind of screwing pressure of the conditions that they were in. And yeah, I saw the whole novel, and then I resisted it because, if you know my previous novels, they're distinctly rooted in Donegal, where I grew up. I mean, I haven't lived there for 25 years, but they were full of a sort of a very distinct, very rich lyrical English, evoking the Ireland that I was writing about. And I couldn't write that kind of novel for this. So what I realized was I would have to literally rip out of my sentences the music, not so much the music, but the particular aspects of the language that made my books Irish. Mm-hmm. And so that was interesting. And I sort of stripped the sentence back. And I also took inspiration from Seamus Heaney, who was from Derry. And Derry was next door to where I grew up, and he too needed to get out of Ireland now and again. And he went into myth. He went into the Greeks. And I think it allows you to get some kind of just a change of air. Can do the writer good. And so what I found when I was writing this book was that I was actually creating a book that's really just set within my own personal mythology. I mean, it's ostensibly set in South America, but really what you're in a Paul Lynch novel. And I remember when my wife started reading it, she was the first reader, and she was reading the first few pages. She said, "Oh my goodness, this doesn't sound like you." And then after 50 pages, she was like, "Oh, this is totally you," because it's a Paul Lynch book.
But there is a real sense. There's a real sense that the language is slightly different. I mean, you are a very intensely lyrical writer, and in all of your novels you have been, and then this book, it does feel different. So it's interesting to hear you talk about that, the sort of the willed change in the language that you did, because it's quite apparent.
Yeah, I mean, the book couldn't have carried that rich Irish syntax. It just the music, it couldn't have carried it. And also, I mean, it's a book it's a minimalist novel. I mean, so some reviewers compared it to Hemingway, which is The Old Man of the Sea, which is, it seems like it's only a comparison because it's an obvious comparison, because that's a guy on a boat, but to me it's a very different book. And I actually went away and reread Old Man of the Sea after I finished this book, just to make sure I hadn't done something crazy. And I was like, yeah, this is nothing like that. So, I was happy with that. But that kind of sunbaked feeling has to come into the language. That feeling of the rawness of the elements of. I mean, what the language has to reflect what the men see, which is not very much. But it also the book also allowed me to go into aspects of the psychological. So the language is always, it's not just based on the natural elements. It's it's probing, because, you know, like the thing is what's happening here is there's a line from Nietzsche that the way to one's own heaven is always through the voluptuousness of one's own hell. And the book goes into the voluptuousness of, in particular, Bolivar's hell. It goes into his mindscape, and because it's fundamentally about his changes. And so I had a lot of room to move, even though it seems that you don't have any room at all to move.
It's funny, Paul, because obviously I read this book a couple of years ago, and then I read it today again, and it was really striking for me because it felt like almost like a sort of a lockdown pandemic novel. You have these people who are sort of in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, yeah. Nobody's more surprised than me about this, because it is essentially a novel about social isolation. And you know, I was reminded of when the anthrax scare was happening about, was it 10 years ago? I can't remember. And Scott Ian from Anthrax, the famous guitar player of Anthrax in New York, said, "I'm not going to die an ironic death." And, you know, the thought occurred to me, you know, that, you know, so that I finished writing this book maybe 2018, something like that. And here we are now in 2021. And I'm living on a boat essentially with my family, and we're at sea, and we're all at sea, and we're all trying to figure out when is this going to end? And, you know, if there's rescue in sight, which now there is, but through the vaccines, but there was a time when we didn't know, you know, and we're all of us battling with the same hope and despair that the characters in Beyond the Sea are battling with. And, you know, the fact is that sooner or later in life, the unwanted knocks on our door, and that's something I'm deeply interested in as a writer. And, you know, for Bolivar, the unwanted was the storm and being cast at sea. But we're now at sea, and so it could be read as a lockdown novel. And a few people have said that. It's definitely. The thing is, though, is I suspect that if you read this novel now, the perspective will be that this lockdown is quite tame compared to how things could be.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting.
So you haven't quite made a sort of a DIY sort of homemade Virgin Mary effigy yet in your household?
No, when things aren't that bad, we're not praying to God here. Yeah, you know, you know, when things get really bad, we just leave the house and go for a run. That's you know, within our 5K restriction, of course, because we have in Dublin, you know, we have a 5K restriction.
I was going to say that one of the things in the book that is quite fun is that, in fact, the two men have a very different reaction to that social isolation, in the sense that, you know, Bolivar, obviously it's very difficult for him, but he seems to start to enjoy it. Like his life, he had concerns, and now everything gets sort of stripped away, and he can just focus on this sort of survival issue. Whereas Hector is really struggling with the lack of social connection. And this is, again, made me think about what we're going through right now, is that you know, we see that happening now.
Yeah, and we all have different coping mechanisms. And, you know, it's become apparent right now that this is the case. And we all have friends, we all know people who are coping with this in very different ways. And in the book, it's exactly the same. And Bolivar is somebody who, you know, I mean, he begins the novel as a completely indifferent character. He is an unlikable, ironic man who takes nothing seriously. And Hector is somebody who has commitments, and he has a girlfriend, and he has a football team, and he's clearly a man in the community. And as you know, as time passes by, initially they're really at odds with each other, you know, and then they form this very strange but beautiful odd friendship, where they're you know, they have to work together. But you know, Bolivar is somebody who realizes that the only way forward here is to literally live in the moment. It's to bring life back down to the small details, simple tasks. You do one thing and then you do another thing. and that's how you get through the day. And if you spend your time thinking about the overall problem, you will go mad. But Hector cannot do that. Hector can only see the problem, and he sees to such an extent that after a while he becomes alienated from his own self, and he begins to believe that he's actually back on land, that he can see himself living the life that he should be living, but he's not there, but he's also not here on the boat either. And so he becomes completely alienated from himself. And I mean, that's the start of a meditative, philosophical conversation in the book that comes from perhaps my own meditation practice. You know, the book has a number of people said to me that there's a Zen quality to it, and there's certainly a conversation quietly being had in the book about how we attend to life and how we attend to the details, and how that level of attention is what actually gets us through or not. And as the book progresses, silence starts to enter into the novel. The feeling of quiet, and there are these white spaces in the text that are just literally just the passing of time, where nothing happens. And Bolivar in particular becomes deeply affected by this. I mean, he begins, the book is you know, all of this talk about the survival and the challenges is really just the introduction to Bolivar's changes of character. The book is really about what happens to Bolivar, and the silence begins to enter into him, and he becomes I think by the end of the book, he's a wise man. I think he's reached, it's not that he's transcended, but he's reached a plane of knowledge that very, very few people, I think, possibly can reach. And it's very interesting for me to sort of watch that change in him. It's as if I didn't write it. It seems to be independent of me. It's very unusual. But he seems to have arrived at this place of almost transcendent sort of reality. Yeah.
There is that moment, a couple of moments sort of very close together from what I remember, when there's a question of what is consciousness, how small human consciousness it is when it's confronted by something as vast as the Pacific. And that, as you said, he does lots of small tasks. And actually, as you were saying that, it reminded me of the Zen koan, not the Zen koan, the Zen saying about, you've just eaten, so wash your rice bowl. I guess that feeling of, do one thing and then do the next thing.
I love that. And, in many ways, the book is what I think what I wanted to do with this book. I say what I wanted to do. All writers rationalize after they finish the novel. So while I was writing it, I didn't quite know what I was doing. But what I realized after I'd written the book was that in many ways I was having a conversation with some writers that mean a lot to me. That there's a particular kind of the novel of alienation, which was a very big thing in sort of the 1950s in particular, kind of reached the high point. And it's a conversation that began in the late 19th century with Melville and Bartleby, and Bartleby's silence, Bartleby's famous refusal. And it's the start of a certain kind of metaphysics in the modern novel, this kind of deep sadness that's felt it's felt in modern fiction, which is the absence of God. And Dostoevsky takes up the mantle from Melville, and he continues the conversation with his underground man who's trying to figure out, he's battling something enormous, which is this sense of despair and shame in the absence of without faith, or the absence of God. And that kind of Conrad took it to a really subtle, brilliant place in Heart of Darkness. And the conversation, alienated mankind was really grappling in fiction with this question of who are we and how do we find meaning in this existence? It seems to me, to a certain extent, that Beckett drove it into a cul-de-sac. That Beckett took it to an end point at which it could not be furthered, or at least at that point. And then the conversation in fiction has changed, and it's gone off in many, many directions. But it seems to me that we are living in a very, you know, if underneath the noise and the mayhem, there is a very, very deep spiritual malaise within the West at the moment. And I think this conversation needs to resurface again in some way or other. And that's something that I was seeking to do with this book. And my own attempt, what I found is somebody who's been meditating, and I don't belong to a meditative tradition per se, but a spiritual tradition. But it seemed to me that looking to the East was a way of generating of finding a continuation of this conversation, of picking up the conversation that I mean, it occurs. It's definitely there in certain writers over the last 50 to 70 years, but it's not a mainstream conversation anymore. And I think it's a conversation most people wouldn't even be aware was being had in many of the books that it's occurring, because I think we've lost the philosophical thread. And but I sought to continue this in my own sort of small way, and the idea of looking to the East, and that's kind of quietly at work in the novel.
That I'm going to have to sadly draw this to a close, Paul, but I do very much appreciate your considered and thoughtful answers to our questions. I'd love to know what you're writing on now, and if we're going to see this theme in your next book. I know that you don't talk about your next book, so I'm not going to ask the question, but I will say thank you very much to you and also to Michelle for your time.
Greatly appreciated.
Lovely to chat with both of you.